Before America was built on dreams, it was built on chains. This is the story of how freedom's nation was born in the shadow of slavery. They were called property, but they were mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters. Their only crime was being born with skin the color of freedom denied. Before the world spoke of human rights, before equality became a word written into law, millions of people lived and died as possessions. In the eyes of those who ruled, they were not human beings but tools, hands that could be worked, backs that could be whipped, lives that could be traded. Yet every heartbeat inside them carried a silent scream for dignity, for belonging, for the simple right to exist as human. The tragedy of slavery was not only in the chains that bound their bodies, but in the chains that sought to crush their spirit, to erase their names, to convince them they were less than human. Imagine standing on the shores of Africa as ships arrive, massive wooden prisons designed for profit, not people. Imagine the terror of being captured, the cries of mothers clutching their children, the fire-consuming villages, the sound of chains locking around wrists that had once worked the earth freely. That was the beginning of their journey into darkness. The Middle Passage was a voyage of horror that defied imagination. Thousands perished before ever reaching the New World. The air inside those ships was thick with disease, fear, and the suffocating stench of despair. Yet somehow, against all odds, many survived, carried not by hope, but by the instinct to live, to endure, to keep the spark of existence alive. When they arrived, they entered a world that had already decided what they would be. Not citizens, not equals, not even people. They became numbers on a ledger, property that could be bought, sold, insured, and inherited. Their lives were measured in labor, their worth calculated in crops and coin. On the plantations, they worked from the first light of dawn until the last glimmer of dusk, their sweat watering the soil that made their masters rich. Each day was a repetition of pain, each night a reminder that tomorrow would bring the same. The lash was the language of control, the whip the signature of ownership. But even in the fields, among the rows of cotton and sugarcane, humanity refused to die. In the silence of the night, they whispered prayers to a God they were told did not hear them. In the rhythm of their songs, they hid messages of resistance, directions to freedom, promises of reunion. Their music became a code, their faith a weapon against despair. The songs were more than melodies, they were lifelines. They told stories of deliverance, of rivers that would carry them north, of stars that would guide their way, of a land where chains could no longer reach. Slavery was not sustained by ignorance, it was sustained by belief, belief in superiority, belief in profit, belief that one race was destined to rule another. These lies became laws, laws became culture, and culture became identity. Generations were raised to see bondage as natural, to believe that cruelty was justified. The enslaved were taught to obey, to forget their past, to silence their language. But memory is a powerful force, and even when stripped of everything, they remembered who they were. They remembered their ancestors, their songs, their stories. They carried Africa in their hearts, even when they could no longer speak its names aloud. The brutality of slavery did not only wound those in chains, it corrupted the souls of those who held them. To justify the unjustifiable, people learned to close their eyes to suffering. They convinced themselves that profit excused pain, that ownership erased guilt. Churches preached obedience, governments wrote laws that turned injustice into policy, and ordinary men and women built their comfort on the backs of those who could not speak. It is one of the greatest contradictions in human history, a land that declared all men are created equal, while denying equality to millions, and yet The enslaved fought back in ways the world often forgets. Some escaped, guided by stars and faith through forests and rivers. Some rose in rebellion, refusing to die quietly. Some resisted through survival itself, by teaching their children to hope, by keeping their families alive against every effort to destroy them. Every act of endurance was defiance. Every breath was resistance. Harriet Tubman became a living symbol of courage, returning again and again to rescue others from the same chains she escaped. Frederick Douglass turned his suffering into eloquence, his silence into speeches that shook nations. They were proof that no law, no whip, no master could extinguish the fire of freedom once it had been lit. Still, the system was vast, powerful, and relentless. For every man or woman who broke free, thousands remained trapped. The weight of oppression pressed down like an endless storm. Children were born into slavery knowing nothing else. Their first lessons were obedience, their first punishments reminders of their place. And yet within them burned the same question that had haunted generations: why should any man own another? That question, whispered in secret, grew louder with time. It spread from the fields to the cities, from the enslaved to the free, until it became impossible to silence. The tension between freedom and bondage tore at the nation's soul. It shaped politics, divided families, and eventually ignited war. When the Civil War erupted, it was more than a conflict over territory. It was a reckoning with centuries of sin. The blood that soaked the battlefields was the price of denial, the cost of pretending that liberty could coexist with slavery. And even when the chains were legally broken, the struggle was far from over. Emancipation freed the body, but not the mind of a nation still haunted by prejudice. For those who had once been enslaved, freedom was a beginning, not an end. They stepped into a world that promised equality but delivered hostility. Their freedom was fragile, constantly threatened by violence, poverty, and the enduring weight of racism. Yet they built communities, schools, churches, and families with nothing but determination. They took the ashes of their suffering and forged identities rooted in resilience. They proved that no amount of dehumanization could erase the essence of humanity itself. The story of slavery is not only a story of cruelty, it is also a story of survival. It is about the unbreakable will of people who refused to disappear, who turned their pain into power, their oppression into art, their despair into endurance. From the fields of bondage grew voices that would one day shape nations, movements, and revolutions. The rhythms born in chains became the heartbeat of modern music. The faith that carried them became the moral compass of generations. Their legacy is not one of defeat, but of defiance, of triumph against impossible odds. Every nation has its darkness, but few have faced it as profoundly as this one. To speak of slavery is to speak of humanity's capacity for both evil and endurance, cruelty and compassion. It is a reminder that progress is not inevitable. It is fought for, paid for, and earned through suffering. The age of slavery may belong to the past, but its echoes remain in the present, shaping the world in ways that cannot be ignored. The memory of those who lived and died in chains demands to be remembered not as shadows, but as the architects of courage who, in their silence, taught the world the true meaning of freedom before America was built on dreams. It was built on chains. This is the story of how freedom's nation was born in the shadow of slavery. The contradiction is staggering. A country founded on liberty, independence, and equality, yet built upon the backs of millions who were denied all three. In the beginning, there were no monuments, no flags, no anthems. There were only ships filled with human cargo, carrying the cries of men, women, and children who had been stolen from their homes. The land that would one day be called the United States was a place of both promise and punishment, a land where hope and horror existed side by side. The soil was rich, but it was fertilized with blood and tears. The hands that worked it were bound, the hearts that endured it were broken, and the profits it yielded went to those who called themselves free. Slavery was not an accident of history. It was a design, deliberate and efficient. It was written into law, defended by religion, justified by pseudoscience, and protected by violence. From the very birth of the colonies, the system of human bondage became the engine of economic power. Tobacco, sugar, rice, and cotton became empires, and the bodies of enslaved people were the currency that sustained them. Ships left ports in Europe filled with goods and returned with human beings, turning suffering into commerce, despair into wealth. Across the Atlantic, in the plantations of Virginia and the Carolinas, men and women labored from sunrise to sunset under the lash, creating fortunes for others while owning nothing, not even themselves. The cruelty of slavery was not only in its physical brutality, but in its psychological warfare. It sought to erase the humanity of the enslaved, to convince them they were born for servitude. Names were stripped away, replaced with numbers or foreign words that meant nothing to them. Families were divided without mercy. Children were sold before they could remember their mothers' faces. Every connection to heritage and identity was systematically broken. Yet, within the silence of their pain, there remained a defiant spark, a belief that freedom was their birthright, that one day the chains would fall. That faith became a language of resistance, spoken through song, prayer, and quiet acts of courage. In the night, when overseers slept, songs rose from the quarters, melodies filled with sorrow and coded hope. Follow the drinking gourd, they sang, a reference to the Big Dipper guiding them north toward freedom. Each lyric was a secret map, each verse a reminder that the spirit could not be chained. Slavery was designed to destroy the soul, but instead it revealed the strength of the human heart. The enslaved built families, even when the world tried to tear them apart. They built communities in the shadows, shared stories of survival, and taught their children that they were more than what their oppressors claimed. Their existence was resistance, their hope an act of rebellion. The hypocrisy of America's founding ideals became more glaring with each passing generation. The same men who declared all men are created equal wrote laws that made slavery a protected institution. Freedom was reserved for the few, while the many suffered beneath their power. Religion was twisted into a weapon, used to justify bondage with words that distorted Scripture. Even as revolutions in Europe and the Americas cried out for liberty, enslaved Africans were forced to build the very symbols of that freedom. They constructed the nation's capital, raised the crops that funded its wars, and served the leaders who denied their humanity. Every stone of early America carried their fingerprints, every field whispered their names. Still, the cracks in the system began to show. The enslaved were not silent, and their allies began to rise. Writers, preachers, and thinkers, black and whites, spoke out against the horror of slavery. Frederick Douglass, born into bondage, taught himself to read and became one of the most powerful voices of his time. Sojourner Truth, a woman who had endured both slavery and its aftermath, stood before crowds demanding that the world recognize her humanity. Their words became weapons sharper than any sword, piercing the conscience of a nation built on contradiction. But for every voice of reason, there were countless others who clung to power and profit, willing to preserve slavery at any cost. The tension between the ideals of freedom and the reality of bondage grew unbearable. America was split in two, half slave, half free, each side reflecting a different version of its identity. When the Civil War finally erupted, it was not just a political conflict, it was a moral reckoning. The fields once filled with slaves became battlefields filled with soldiers. The fight was not only for territory, but for the soul of a nation that had lost its way. As bodies fell on both sides, the question of what America truly stood for hung in the air like smoke. When President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it was a turning point, but not an ending. Freedom declared on paper did not erase the suffering of centuries. The enslaved had to fight for their liberation with their own hands, joining the Union armies, guiding others to safety, rebuilding lives from ashes. Even after victory, the promise of equality remained distant. The war had ended, but the prejudice that fueled slavery endured. Reconstruction began with hope, but soon the old systems of oppression reemerged under new names: sharecropping, segregation, disenfranchisement. The chains were gone, but their shadow stretched long across generations. The legacy of slavery did not vanish when the last master fell. It lived on in laws, in language, in the structures of society that favored some and oppressed others. The descendants of the enslaved carried the weight of history on their shoulders, yet they also carried its strength. From the songs sung in the fields came the birth of blues, gospel, and jazz, music that told the story of pain and perseverance. From those denied education rose scholars, inventors, and leaders who reshaped the world. From the silence of slavery emerged the roar of movements for civil rights, justice, and equality. To understand America's greatness, one must first understand its darkness. The wealth, power, and progress celebrated by history were built on the suffering of those who were never meant to be remembered. Yet, remembering them is not just an act of history, it is an act of truth. The enslaved were not nameless shadows, they were dreamers, thinkers, creators. They carried within them the same brilliance and hope as any who called themselves free. Their endurance is the foundation of the nation's conscience, a reminder that freedom earned through oppression is not true freedom at all. Every nation must face the truth of its beginnings, and for America, that truth lies in the contradiction of its ideals. To deny it is to erase the voices that built its strength. The story of slavery is not only about pain, it is about power reclaimed, identity preserved, and spirit unbroken. It is the story of how a people stripped of everything still managed to give the world art, culture, and a vision of freedom stronger than the chains that tried to destroy it. It is the story of how liberty itself was redefined by those who were denied it, how the enslaved became the truest guardians of freedom's meaning, and how from the darkest chapter of history emerged the light that still guides the struggle for equality. Before America was built on dreams, it was built on chains. This is the story of how freedom's nation was born in the shadow of slavery. Long before the skyscrapers, before the Constitution, before the idea of liberty became a global symbol, there were the cries of people ripped from their homeland, carried across the ocean in darkness. Their bodies became the foundation upon which the wealth of a nation was built. Their labor turned fields into fortunes, their pain turned cotton into gold. The world remembers the greatness of America, but too few remember the cost of its creation. They were human beings, fathers, mothers, children, yet they were bought and sold like objects, entire families torn apart in the name of profit. Ships filled with the stench of death crossing the Atlantic, each wave carrying stories that would never be told. Those who survived were forced to work from sunrise to sunset, treated not as men and women, but as tools of production. The chains were more than metal, they were symbols of domination, designed to crush the human spirit and erase identity. And yet, within the deepest suffering, something refused to die, the desire to be free. Slavery was not born of ignorance. It was a deliberate system, crafted to justify greed and power. It was written into laws, defended in pulpits, and rationalized in textbooks. People convinced themselves that others were less than human because it was profitable to believe so. It is one of the darkest truths of history. Evil often wears the mask of reason. Those who preached equality practiced oppression, and those who claimed to love God enslaved his children. The hypocrisy was not hidden, it was woven into the very fabric of the young nation. On plantations stretching across the South, the economy thrived on suffering. The crack of the whip became the rhythm of production. The sweat of the enslaved watered the fields that made men rich. From tobacco to rice, from sugar to cotton, every industry grew from their forced labor. Northern merchants financed it, European markets demanded it, and governments ignored it. Slavery was not just a Southern issue, it was an American one, a human one. The profits of bondage built banks, cities, and universities that still stand today. And yet, amidst the cruelty, the enslaved did not surrender their humanity. They created languages, songs, and spirituals that carried messages of hope and defiance. Their faith became a weapon, their unity a quiet revolution. Through whispered hymns and coded melodies, they mapped the path to freedom. The Underground Railroad was more than a network. It was a heartbeat of courage that refused to stop. Harriet Tubman, who returned again and again to rescue others, became a living symbol of fearless resistance. Frederick Douglass, who rose from the whip to the podium, turned words into weapons of truth. These individuals shattered the myth that the enslaved were powerless. They proved that even in the darkest night, light could break through. But their bravery came at a cost. Every act of rebellion, every escape, every whisper of hope was met with brutal retaliation. Slavery was not just physical bondage, it was psychological warfare meant to convince an entire people that they were less than human. But the human spirit, once awakened, cannot be silenced forever. The fight against slavery grew from whispers to roars. Abolitionists, black and white alike, began to challenge the system that had corrupted a nation's soul. Pamphlets were written, speeches were delivered, protests were staged. The truth began to spread like wildfire, exposing the contradictions of a country that celebrated freedom while denying it to millions. The debate tore America apart, leading to one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. The Civil War was not just a fight over land or politics. It was a moral reckoning, a battle for the soul of the nation. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, the chains were legally broken, but freedom did not arrive with fanfare. It came slowly, painfully, unevenly. Many former slaves found themselves free in name, but trapped in poverty and prejudice. The land they had worked was denied to them. The rights they had earned were stripped away through violence and law. Reconstruction promised equality, but racism rebuilt itself in new forms. Sharecropping replaced slavery, segregation replaced chains, and silence replaced justice. The old system simply evolved, wearing a different face but carrying the same heart of hatred. Still, the legacy of those who endured slavery lived on. Their resilience became the root of black culture, the foundation of music, literature, and spirit that shaped generations to come. The songs once sung in fields became the blues, the gospel, the heartbeat of American art. Their strength echoed in every fight for civil rights, every march for justice, every voice that dared to speak truth to power. The enslaved were not victims of history. They were architects of survival. The age of slavery was more than a period of oppression. It was a mirror reflecting humanity's capacity for both cruelty and courage. It forces us to ask difficult questions about power, privilege, and morality. It challenges the myths we tell about progress, reminding us that greatness built on suffering is not greatness at all. The echoes of that age still shape the world we live in. Inequality, prejudice, and systemic injustice are not ghosts of the past. They are the shadows that follow us. To understand slavery is to understand the foundation of America itself. The contradictions that defined its birth, the promise of liberty alongside the practice of bondage, still define its struggles today. The wealth that grew from enslaved labor did not disappear. It passed down through generations, shaping the structures of society. The trauma of bondage, too, passed down, carried in memory, in fear, in the silent resilience of those who refused to be broken. History does not stay buried. It breathes through us, demanding to be seen. Every nation has its darkness, but America's is particularly profound because it hides beneath the language of freedom. The same ideals that inspired revolution also justified oppression. This paradox has haunted the country for centuries, forcing it to wrestle with its own reflection. To look at slavery honestly is not to hate America. It is to see it clearly. It is to honor the truth, however uncomfortable, and to recognize the debt owed to those who suffered so others might prosper. Their stories are not just history, they are inheritance. The courage of those who endured cannot be erased by time or silence. They are the true founders of perseverance, the authors of faith against all odds. Their blood built nations, their prayers built hope, and their strength built the moral backbone of humanity itself. The age of slavery may belong to the past, but its shadow still stretches across the present. The wounds it left are not just scars on history. They are echoes in society, in inequality, in the struggle for justice that continues today. Yet from that darkness came a strength that refuses to fade. The men and women who lived and died in chains built more than an economy. They built a legacy of courage, endurance, and faith that still shapes the soul of humanity. Their suffering taught the world the cost of freedom and the power of resilience. To remember them is not to dwell on pain, but to honor their endurance. To speak their names is to acknowledge the truth that greatness built on injustice must be rebuilt in truth and compassion. The story of slavery is not only a story of despair. It is a reminder of the indestructible power of the human spirit. The chains that once bound bodies could not imprison hope, and that hope continues to guide us toward a future where freedom means more than a word, where equality is not an aspiration but a reality, and where humanity finally learns from its darkest chapter to build a brighter, just, and united world.